Good day. Another day and another week, and more goes on in the global crisis, which we are now all of ourselves find ourselves in, and which is centered on Ukraine. Now, at the start of every week, it's the beginning of further developments. There's going to be an important NATO meeting shortly, where apparently hopes of ratifying Finland's and Sweden's joining of NATO, those hopes are now fading, given Turkish opposition to this move, which appears to be hardening. And there's also supposed to be an EU summit meeting, which President Zelensky of Ukraine is due to attend, and where he expects, and I expect, that Ukraine will be granted candidate status to join the EU. Now, most people, myself again included, believe that this candidate status will take a very long time to be converted into actual status. The deputy head of Russia's Security Council, the former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, has said mockingly that by the time Ukraine becomes actually eligible to join the EU itself as a full member, neither Ukraine nor most probably the EU itself will exist, and that will probably also be sometime in the middle of this century. And I agree with that. But I would say that certain moves that Ukraine has been making over the last few days, and which have been very strangely reported, at least I think so, in the media in the West, or to show why it is extremely unwise at present, to put it mildly, to agree to Ukraine joining the EU, if of course one takes the EU's much claimed principles of democracy, diversity, human rights and all the rest at all seriously. Because Ukraine now seems to be in full campaign to, as is being discussed in some media outlets, including the British outlet, the British newspaper, The Guardian, Ukraine is now in full campaign to purge itself of every connection it has with Russia. There's just been an announcement that in the Nikolaev region, in southern Ukraine, a territory that is on the Black Sea, and where the predominant language is indeed Russian, that the actual use of Russian in schools, and apparently the teaching of Russian in schools, is to be banned. And there's now a law that is working its way through the Ukrainian parliament, which also bans the broadcasting in Ukraine of Russian music written and performed since 1991, and Russian literature published and written and published since 1991. 1991 being the year the Soviet Union broke up, and when Ukraine obtained its independence. Now, I am assuming that communist literature of the pre-1991 Soviet era is also essentially banned in Ukraine. But in any event, these attacks on Russian culture and this all-encompassing campaign to apparently rename all streets that have any reference to Russia, to tear down monuments that connect Ukraine to Russia. All of these seem to me extremely sinister and very wrong, and to say it straightforwardly, in gross contradiction to the kind of values that I've always supposed, or at least always been told, I no longer suppose, always been told that the European Union stands for. And yet I have been reading in parts of the British media, The Guardian for example, that this is a part of Ukraine's campaign to free itself of Russian influence, to put behind it the history of its rule by Moscow, and this has been discussed in not so much neutral terms as almost quietly supportive terms, something which I find quite extraordinary, and again entirely at variance with the values that The Guardian and other left-wing journals in Britain and in the United States and in Europe purport to support. And I say that because, of course, The Guardian is itself a strong supporter of the EU. It was a vigorous supporter of Britain remaining in the EU. And yet we see that with Ukraine, it is, let's put it like this, at least acquiescent in a policy, a set of policies by the Ukrainian government, which to my mind are supposed to appear to be at almost total variance with the project that the EU is supposed to embody. Well, as I said, I no longer really believe very much that the EU really does stand for these sort of values. I had some lingering beliefs that The Guardian did. Well, these clearly don't apply where Russia is concerned. But anyway, there we are. I nonetheless still agree with Medvedev that Ukraine will not join the EU anytime soon. So perhaps the fact that the Ukrainians are doing all of these things is not really that important so far as Ukraine's membership of the EU is concerned. Of course, in terms of development in the war, it is a completely different matter. We see the Ukrainian government taking a step which I can't help but think is going to be seen as a hostile step by the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. It's going to be very poorly received in places like Kharkiv, Odessa, Nikolaev, Zaporozhye, at a time when one might have expected Ukraine to seek to unite all its various people against what it says is Russian aggression. It is taking a step which I suspect is going to divide many of those people. It's going to reinforce the belief that many Russian speakers in Ukraine have that the government in Kiev is indeed hostile to them, and that when the Russians say that they're acting in Ukraine to defend the rights of Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine, that they have a point. So I think it is counterproductive. I think it is also, of course, disastrously counterproductive in relation to negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. The Russians have consistently made it a war aim that Ukraine should take certain steps to cleanse itself of the ideology of the 1930s. And amongst those demands, within those demands, are demands that Ukraine take steps to protect the rights of Russian speakers. These actions by Ukraine appear to slam the door shut on all of that, making any negotiations between Russia and Ukraine even more difficult than they already are, and provoking the Russians to even greater anger and hardening their determination to see this campaign against Ukraine through to its conclusion, to the conclusion that Russia itself has in mind. Now, perhaps that wouldn't matter so much from Ukraine's point of view if the war were indeed going in Ukraine's favour, as the Ukrainians claimed that it was a few weeks ago. But in reality and in fact, and as the Ukrainians are now increasingly admitting, the situation for Ukraine in Donbass is going from bad to worse, almost with each passing day, and demands and words from Ukrainian leaders are becoming increasingly desperate and increasingly shrill. And Ukrainians are making ever more extravagant demands from Western weapons. The Arestovich, who is President Zelensky's spokesman, spoke in exasperation about the fact that Ukraine is not getting the kind of weapons supplies from the West that it needs. I think even the Western powers are becoming increasingly astonished and horrified by the extent of Ukraine's demands for weapons, demands which the West is simply not able to keep. And in fact, we've heard over the last couple of hours, days, more news from the front lines, more news of very heavy Ukrainian casualties, more news of more villages being captured by the Russians, of the main road between Bakhmut and Severodonetsk now being cut. The Russians apparently have opened a roadblock, an actual roadblock on this road. They actually have severed this road. I mean, obviously I can't confirm these reports, but that's the information I'm getting of the difficulties now of actually supplying, keeping the troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk supplied, multiplying by the day, of the increasingly desperate straits of these troops. And one also hears reports of increasing Ukrainian casualties and of Ukrainian troops refusing to fight. Apparently the command of an entire brigade, or at least this is the story that one is hearing, the command of one entire brigade apparently has been sacked because they ordered a retreat going against instructions from Kiev. And another military unit, apparently, the unit has been recalled pending an investigation because several hundred men who make up that Ukrainian unit apparently said that they were not prepared to fight and be used as cannon fodder in what is becoming an increasingly hopeless battle in Donbass. So things are not looking well for Ukraine in Donbass. As I've been saying, this is a grinding, incremental battle, a war of attrition, but it is a war of attrition which is working out very much to Russian advantage. And I understand that the Ukrainians massively reinforced their forces in Donbass after the fighting around Kiev, something which was arguably most unwise. And the result is that the best part of their army, the flower of their army, of their youth, and increasingly older men too, are being killed, wounded, and taken prisoner there. So it doesn't seem to me to make much sense at this present time to provoke the Russians to greater anger, greater wrath, and to persuade the Russians to take steps that will persuade the Russians to maintain the war at a time when the war is going badly for Ukraine. And Ukraine is doing other things which seem to me to be at least as ill-advised. And at this point, I'm not making any value judgments or ethical judgments, though frankly I should. And many, of course, are doing so. Ukraine continues to shell Donetsk, the capital of the Donetsk People's Republic. As I've said many times, I completely fail to see any military logic behind this shelling. And a few hours ago, there were reports which appear to be confirmed that the Ukrainians launched some sort of attacks against oil rigs, Russian oil rigs in the Black Sea, causing damage to some of these oil rigs. It's all rationalized as explained as another attack on Snake Island, except it doesn't seem to have actually involved any real attack on Snake Island. It seems instead that these oil rigs, civilian installations, were attacked instead. Now, I would make one further point, which is, of course, that Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, Ukraine says is Ukrainian. And, of course, Ukraine also says that the people of Donetsk are Ukrainian citizens. The oil rigs in the Black Sea, which have been attacked, are apparently connected to Crimea. They are in what Ukraine claims its own economic zone. Obviously, the Russians took over these oil rigs when they took over Crimea in 2014, but there is at least a possibility, indeed a strong likelihood, that some of the people who were on those oil rigs when they were attacked, civilians I would reiterate, are from Crimea, in which case they are Ukrainian citizens according to Ukraine also. So it does seem again extraordinary that Ukraine should be attacking civilian installations in what it says is its own territory when there is no actual military rationale for it. And again, I wonder why they are doing that. Is it perhaps in order to intimidate Russian speakers in what remains of Ukraine? As I said, what it is more likely to do, or so it seems to me, is persuade those Russian speakers that Ukraine as a state is hostile and inimical to them and make them look for protection to Russia. So I don't see the logic of this in any way. Now, I've spoken about Russian advances in Donbass, but of course the Russians have been busy doing lots of other things. They've launched more missile strikes on various installations in and around Odessa. There is now clearly some kind of an aerial war going on in and around Odessa. It's been going on for a long time, and I suspect the reason for that is because Odessa is seen as some sort of transit point for some of these weapons deliveries from the West. Presumably some of them pass through the Odessa railway system. But also it does seem as if the Russians are concentrating on Ukrainian aerial defenses and missile installations in and around Odessa, because the Ukrainians, with the support of the Western powers, seem to be trying to build these up in order to try to challenge Russian control of the Black Sea. That isn't going to be successful, in my opinion. You only have to again look at the balance of naval forces in the Black Sea. Russia has an effective navy in the Black Sea. Ukraine has no navy at all and no possibility of Western reinforcement. And of course, Ukraine has only a very small air force, only very few numbers of aircraft still flying. It has, despite denials, undoubtedly, to my mind, received some fighter jets and other Soviet-era jets from the East European states that make up NATO. There was, as some of you may remember, strong denials that this would happen back in at the start of the war. But it does seem as if this has indeed happened. And as I said, some of these aerial forces have been used by Ukraine, but they seem to be the target of further losses, further attacks by the Russian Air Force. So the situation doesn't look good for Ukraine on any front, but they seem to be pressing ahead, as I said, with all these anti-Russian measures that I talked about. And perhaps the single biggest military move over the last couple of days, which has been claimed by the Russians, is a aerial or missile strike on what the Russians claim to be a command post, an important command post of the Ukrainian military in the city of Dnipro, which the Russians still call by its old Soviet name of Dnipropetrovsk. And the Russians claim that 50 high-ranking officers of the Ukrainian armed forces, including several generals, were killed in that strike. I've no idea whether that is true. I've seen no independent corroboration of that. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians have each claimed at various times to have killed senior commanders of the other side. I'm skeptical about both claims, but for what it's worth, this one does seem a little more plausible than some of the others, if only because it does seem as if this missile strike did actually happen. So there we go. Now, perhaps the biggest news, the most serious news connected with the Ukrainian war doesn't actually concern or involve Ukraine at all. It involves another part of Russia entirely, which is the region of Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is part of Russia. It used to be German. It used to be part of the Prussian province of Königsberg, but it was captured by the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War, and as part of the various treaties and agreements that were made at the end of the Second World War, it was formally annexed by the Soviet Union and incorporated in what was then the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, what is now the Russian Federation, in other words, today's Russia. And it's become a Russian area. The German population left or was expelled after the end of the Second World War. The city of Königsberg became Kaliningrad, and this is now a major center for the Russian military in the Baltic Sea. Now, at the end of the Soviet Union, a whole series of agreements and treaties were agreed whereby cargo was allowed to travel across Lithuania, across the Baltic states, from Russia to Kaliningrad, which is otherwise cut off territorially from Russia. Now, over the weekend, Lithuania confirmed that it was stopping the transit of such goods to Kaliningrad. Around 50% of the goods that Kaliningrad needs have passed via railways from across Lithuania, and the Lithuanians, with the backing of the European Union, have now blocked this transit traffic. And this is explained as needed to enforce European Union sanctions. Well, I have to say straight away that this seems to me an extraordinarily ill-judged action. I don't think it does, in fact, enforce European Union sanctions. It is a major act of harassment against Russia. It is clearly intended to provoke the Russians. I think, in fact, and without much difficulty, the Russians will be able to keep Kaliningrad supplied by sea. The Russian governor of Kaliningrad, has said that the Russians are in a position to do that. And I expect and predict that that is precisely what is going to happen. But regardless, here we see another step taken by the Western powers, by the Baltic states, to cause increasing hardship to the Russian population, reinforcing the belief that many Russians undoubtedly have that the West is out to get them. Not their government, but them themselves, the Russian people, thereby, in effect, validating all the points that President Putin made when he said that Western policy was hostile to Russia and therefore justified his decision back in February to launch the special operation in Ukraine. Now, I don't see the logic of this. It seems petulant. It seems bad-tempered to me on the part of the Europeans. It seems unbelievably provocative. And, of course, potentially it is dangerous as well. Because, of course, if the Western powers were to start taking steps to try to interfere with sea traffic between Russia and Kaliningrad, then all I can say is we would be in a period of extremely dangerous confrontation as well, and military confrontation in the Baltic at a time when the Western powers have been telling everybody that they want to contain the crisis to Ukraine itself. Well, there we are, a situation where Ukraine has been taking steps that will provoke the Russians, where Lithuania and the European Union are trying to take steps which are going to provoke the Russians, all at a time when Ukraine is visibly and clearly losing the war, and losing the war in a disastrous way. None of this makes any sense to me. It seems to me that anger is now increasingly taking control of Western decisions. One is almost reminded of an angry teenager smashing all the furniture in a tantrum when they are denied the thing they want. And this is increasingly, it seems to me, how Western leaders and indeed Ukrainian leaders are starting to behave. And there are, of course, tantrums and recriminations raging within the West itself. There's been more criticism of Viktor Orban by various members of the European Parliament, and everything, frankly, gives the increasing impression of things going increasingly wrong. I am getting the impression that Western electorates are becoming more and more unimpressed. We see growing disillusionment in Britain with both of the major political parties, both of which, of course, have been supporting the Ukraine war. And, of course, we've seen elections in France where the establishment parties, those which support Emmanuel Macron, have done extremely badly, and where Macron has lost his majority in the French Parliament. We will be discussing those elections in a programme we shall be doing shortly on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I. But there we are. Growing petulance, growing anger, more and more irrational decisions. A sense that the exhilaration, the intoxication of the early weeks of the war, when one was sensed that Western leaders were throwing off all restraints and were almost delighted to engage Russia in an economic and all-encompassing sanctions war, which they were confident they would win quickly, that that delirium of intoxication and joy almost, of throwing off of inhibitions, of hitting out at a country and its leader, Vladimir Putin, that they dislike and despise, that all that is now gradually giving way to anger and even more reckless decisions, as all the great expectations, all the hopes and anticipations of quick economic victory and even military victory over Russia that existed at the end of February and at the beginning of March have turned to dust. And I will finish this program by saying that it's been absolutely fascinating to see how apparently in Germany, the fact that they're running out of gas and that they're running out of oil is now causing a drift back to coal. It's more complicated than it seems because, of course, they've also denied themselves access to Russian coal, which is probably the cheapest and most reliable coal that they could get. So they're going to, since they've closed the coal mines in the Ruhr, they're going to have to turn now to the lignite mines, the brown coal of East Germany, which they've been wanting to close down for a long time because it is so highly polluting. But there we are. That, it seems, is what they are going to have to do. A green government, or rather a government heavily dominated by Greens. The Vice-Chancellor is a Green, the Foreign Minister is a Green, is now turning to the dirtiest, the most old-fashioned of all fuels, of all fossil fuels. It seems an astonishing turnaround, a remarkable comment on the follies that we have seen enacted over the last few months, that we're going all the way back to the fossil fuel that fired the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Instead of going forward to the great era of alternative energy, we're going back to coal. But there it is. That's where we are. That's what's happening. And it seems that in their anger, they are not willing for the moment to take a step back, think through what they're doing, learn any lessons, and change course. Well, that's me for today. There'll be more from me soon. We'll no doubt be getting more developments over the next couple of days. In the meantime, remember that you can find us on other platforms, Rumble and Locals, being obviously perhaps our main ones, but we're also, of course, on Super U and on ODYSEE and on others as well. And please also remember, if you want to support our work, that you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hoodies, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our bomber jackets, and all the rest. And last but not least, please don't forget, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to join to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until we re-engage with each other again.